Welcome to Foundations of Judaism Holidays of History. We're so excited to be with you and again continue this class. I'm sorry for the bumpy start in the beginning of the month. I think the communication was a little off. Sorry about that. We'll try to get that better for next time. What we'll be really looking at today really is the idea of a whole set of holidays in Judaism that are based and were really caused by history. And so really what I mean by that is differentiating from holidays in Judaism that have to do with a biblical commandment, right? So either we have a holiday in Judaism because something the Torah commanded, right? And so, for example, the Torah commands us on the 15th of Nisan, to have Passover, right? On the 15th of Tishrei we have Sukkot, right? And so that's why we do it, because the Bible tells us to do it. These are all holidays which the Torah says absolutely nothing about, the Torah didn't know about, and it really came to mark historical occasions within Jewish history. And it's for that reason that Judaism really is a religion of history, where really our history is seen sort of as a chronicle of God's relationship with man, and celebrating our history is part of sort of what it means to be a Jew, right? And this religion that of Judaism is a religion of people, right? It's a religion of a particular group of people, right? And so there is also an aspect of peoplehood in the history of our nation in general. And so that's really going to be the holidays we're going to be looking at during these next three sections. As I announced in the email, we'll have the first session tonight, next session, the second session next week, and the third session the week after that. We'll end on July 1st, and we'll start the next one on July, the next week, whatever that is. So really, this is these we're going to learn about, just to kind of give you a layout of what we're going to learn about. This first lesson, our hopeful goal is to learn about the holidays of Hanukkah and Purim. Okay, we'll go through those holidays, sort of what the history, what the why is, what we're supposed to be doing on those holidays, where they come from, and everything like that, how to observe them as a Jew. The second session next week will really go into holidays of sadness, really, and destruction. So we'll look at the holidays surrounding the destruction of the temple, the fast days, the days of Jewish grief, really. And these are really old holidays that have been around for 2,000 years. Some of them have even been written about in the prophets, like in the book of Jeremiah mentions a couple of them, the fasts that we would do and we still continue to do. So we'll do that. And then finally, on the third occasion of our meeting, we'll really go through some of the modern holidays that really mostly have to do with the state of Israel. Those holidays would be Yom HaTzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, Yom HaZikaron, which is Israeli Memorial Day, and of course, also not directly having to do with Israel, but sort of have to do with Israel in modern history, is Yom HaShoah, right? It's the day of Holocaust remembrance. So that's kind of the map of where we'll go, and so you'll really know about half of all of the Jewish holidays from this. Eventually, there will be another foundations class called Holidays, Biblical Holidays, right? And that's sort of the second half of this, which is really all the biblical holidays. All right, so sounds good. Everything sounds pretty good. All right, so without further ado, I will share my text sheet with the paper with you guys. And these sheets really are designed as sort of note sheets. People who have been with me in foundations classes before kind of knows how I do things in these classes. So really, I push you to take this paper and have it in front of you, take notes on it. Holly or anybody else, really, I can always send digital copies to you separately. I'm going to share obviously, put the sheet on the screen as we go through it. So I push you to take notes, and really taking notes will help you sort of understand the information and remember it. And what I hope, after taking a bunch of foundations classes, you can sort of put them in a binder eventually. And it's actually a very good resource for you to remember what you learned, to study it, and to really go back, because you'll, a lot of you will be looking at this, trying to observe the holidays, and you'll be like, oh, I need a refresher. This is perfect. So it's really a good thing to do. All right. So I'm going to open now up the screen. Just give me 2 seconds as I stop here. So in order, of course, to talk to you about Purim, which is the first holiday we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about, we have to talk some history. Now, I'll try to, some of this might be a review for some of you, some of this might be, new information for some of you. So that's just the way it is with the class. So there was really a temple. There was a Jewish kingdom in Eretz Israel. Um, First united under a kingship under King Shaul, was the first king of Israel, King Saul in English, and basically ran the kingdom from around 1000 CE, 1100. I'm sorry, 1000 BCE, 1100 BCE or so. If the Exodus is around 1200, the conquering of the land under Joshua and the beginning of the Book of Judges. Eventually in the beginning of the Book of Samuel, around 1100 CE, the Jewish people asked for a king, and basically all the tribes of Israel united under a monarch named Shaul. Second king was David. Third king was Shlomo. Eventually, though, there was a split, and there was really some civil strife. And when we go and do our Jewish history class, we can talk about why that happened. But basically, there was a split between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom after King Shlomo. The northern kingdom was named Israel, and really was known as the Kingdom of Israel. And it really consisted of 10 tribes. And then there was the Kingdom of Judea, which is really consisting mostly of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin as well. And that's was also considered the southern kingdom. These kingdoms lived side by side, sometimes fighting with each other, sometimes not. Eventually, the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians in 720 CE. The higher place was ransacked. The population was taken and taken back to Assyria, and unfortunately assimilated with the rest of Assyria and the rest of cultures around, and were prohibited from observing their religion. This is what the Assyrians sort of did, and because of that, we no longer have those people anymore. Those tribes don't exist anymore. And those are what we call, if you ever heard someone say the 10 lost tribes, right? Those are the 10 lost tribes, right? So all these people try to say, the Jews are in India, they're still doing it. There's Jews all over in China, like maybe they're over there. Regardless, the 10 lost tribes. We haven't heard from them since the Assyria conquered them. Judea, the kingdom of Judea really survived longer, almost more than a century longer than the northern kingdom. But eventually, too, the Judean kingdom was conquered as well. And this is the first note here. You can see it was conquered by the Babylonians in 586 BC. After a long, drawn-out war with Babylonia, and eventually Jerusalem was conquered. And unfortunately, there was really the crown jewel of Jerusalem in the southern kingdom was the temple. Right, the first temple, which was built by King Shlomo, the third king of Israel, King Solomon, and unfortunately the temple was destroyed and burned, and the Jewish community in the southern kingdom was led into exile, and as they were conquered by Babylonia. The conquering, though, for the Babylonians, though, was a little bit different than the Assyrians. They had a little bit of a different policy, probably a smarter policy, honestly, less hard work, which was basically, we're going to keep we're going to exile the community, but we're going to keep them together. And we're not going to try to assimilate them, and we're going to let them practice their religion, but they just can't live in Eretz Israel anymore. So that's what happened. But because of that, the Jewish community really did stay together, right? They did not become assimilated. If Babylon had the same politics and ways of doing things as Assyria did, there would be no more Jewish people. But thankfully, they didn't. And thankfully, as the things happen, Persia conquers Babylonia. And Persia is this great empire, conquers the land of Babylonia, and basically, and that's around 526 CE. So it's only, the first exile was really only 70 years. And just like Babylonia, a different policy than the Assyrians, so too the Persians had a different policy than the Babylonians. The Persians thought they could buy the most peace from their colonies if they allowed the indigenous population to observe their religion and live on their land. Ooh, what a crazy idea, right? And so what Cyrus famously did, the famous Persian emperor, was basically said, the Jews are allowed to return to the land of Israel from Babylonia, and eventually also to rebuild the temple. So that's what a lot of Jews did. And this is what I refer to as Cyrus's policy, right? So you see, we went through the first four items so far. Any questions on sort of anything we went over so far? Is it relatively clear? Okay. So at this point in time, the land of Israel was owned by the Persians, and it was a colony of Persia, the Persian Empire. But unfortunately, we usually think, oh, look, all the Jews went back to Israel and it was so wonderful. But it actually wasn't true. Only 10% of the Jews went back to Israel. Most stayed behind in Babylonia. And that's really one of the reasons why, Babylonian culture has become so much a part of Jewish culture and everything like this. But regardless, these Jews who went back from Babylonia, these heroic Jews who went back to rebuild Eretz Israel and eventually rebuild the temple as well, did so. They were successful in rebuilding Eretz Israel. So basically, that is what happens, and they build this. Sorry, I should have wrote Second Jewish Commonwealth. It really wasn't. It was a colony, really. The rebuilding of and that's the rebuilding and the construction of the Second Temple by Ezra and Nehemiah. Right, so they rebuild the Second Temple, and that's sort of what happens. Between this period, though, between in the 70-year exile, and basically, I'm sorry, not between this period, but after the rebuilding of the Second Temple, there were still, of course, Jews who stayed behind in Babylonia, and then what came Persia eventually. And that's where the story of Purim takes place. It takes place in this time amongst the exiles of Jerusalem. They live in a town called Shushan, okay? And there's this great Persian empire named Ahasuerus, okay? And basically, Ahasuerus is seen as the silly king. And this story is basically narrated in the book of Esther, which I definitely suggest for you to read. You can definitely read it in one night. It's probably take you about a half hour to read. It's a really crazy story, really cool. It's one of those stories in the Bible you just really open up and just read. It's really great narrative. Just on one foot to give you the spark noted version, is basically Ahasuerus is the ruler and is the ruler of all of Persia, and basically the Jews are living in exile as second-class citizens in the land of Persia. Eventually, though, Ahasuerus decides he needs a new queen, okay, and he has this like beauty contest basically, and basically Esther, or her name is also Hadassah, is chosen to be Ahasuerus' new queen, a new bride, who happens to be Jewish. And so she is a Jewish queen. At the same time, her uncle Mordechai refuses to bow down to a new a prime minister of the king named Haman. Okay, Haman makes this basic law that everyone has to bow down to him and respect him. And of course, because Mordechai is a pious Jew, basically says, no, I'm not going to bow down to him being. Haman gets mad and decides not only to kill Mordechai, but to kill all the Jews, destroy all of them, because they're not loyal. Really, first example of real, serious anti-Semitism in that regard, and genocide of the Jews, besides, of course, Egypt and slavery. Through really incredible politicking and amazing audacity, Esther, in the story, decides to tell Ahasuerus that she's Jewish and that basically Mordechai is a good guy. I'm giving an extremely smart noted version, and that you shouldn't do this. And basically everything flips on its head, and Haman ends up getting hung along with all his children, and Mordechai is put into a position of power, and things are good for the Jews. It's a classic story of Jewish power and government, right, in exile. How Jews were able to sustain themselves in basically powerless. Like they had no military arms, they had nothing. They were a tiny little minority, but they could sort of play politics and use their influence to try to protect themselves and try to stop genocide and try to stop the destruction of Jews and everything like this. It's an incredible story. I think one thing that's unique about it is that God does not appear in the Purim story. It's the one book of the Bible in which God doesn't appear. And so I think it really is a story of sort of Jews all of a sudden not experiencing the presence of God, not living with the temple, not living in their own land, and like sort of how to deal with the real reality of just trying to survive. It's a hard story, really not easy. There's a lot of bloodshed in it. At the end, the Jews go and sort of kill all of Haman and Haman's people, and then all these other people, thousands of people they murder. At the heart, not an easy story, but it's a story of miraculous. So really, the way we define in Judaism is we say nahafochu, which means everything turned over, right? And this is the spirit of the day that everything flips over, right? That and one day all the Jews were going to be killed and everybody was going to die and it was going to be awful, this horrible tragedy. And in one day everything flipped around. And instead of the Jews dying, they got this power and their enemies were destroyed. Right? So Purim really celebrates this with great joy, the redemption of the Jewish people, that they were saved, and that everything can flip around in a second. So that just because you see right now things aren't good, things could change around in a second. So that's probably the general theme of Purim. Any questions on the story or anything like that so far? No? Okay. So Purim, the holiday, really celebrates this great miracle, this great thing that happened, that the Jews were saved and that everything changed. We celebrate this through the practice of four mitzvot. Basically, what ended up happening is Esther wrote a letter to all the Jewish communities that were already spread out by this time in different places, saying of this great miracle that happened, the Jews were saved, and saying, basically, you have to observe this holiday. Now, you have to remember this forever, and specifically that you'll remember this in four different ways. Number one, you'll read that letter, right? And so what was that letter? The letter was Megillat Esther, right? The letter was the book of Esther that she sent out to all the Jewish communities. And so she said you have to read this letter both in the night and in the day. So therefore, we have a mitzvah. A mitzvah means a sacred Jewish obligation, right? A commandment from God that we have to be required to do. And if we don't do it, we'll be punished. My God will hold us accountable. Like this is something that is required. I think a lot of people hear mitzvah as good deed, but it's not. I mean, it is good, obviously, but it's a required deed, right? It's something that God requires from us, right, and holds us liable for, right? That's very different than, oh, you do this nice thing, you do this good deed. No one's gonna go after you if you don't do it, right? But this is something difference between you gotta don't murder someone versus make a cure for cancer, right? The don't murder someone's law, right? Versus it would be really good if you could come up with a cure for cancer, but you're not going to be punished if you don't, right? Make sense? So these are what's called mitzvot, but they are mitzvot specifically of rabbinic origin. Why? They're not from the Torah, right? The story of Esther happened after the Torah, right? The events of the Torah. So how could it be commanded within the Torah? So we say it's not a biblical mitzvah. It's not a Torah mitzvah. It's a rabbinic mitzvah. Still required, but of a less of a required nature than, let's say, a biblical mitzvah. So that's specifically commanded within the Torah. So the first mitzvah, as I said, is to read this Megillah at night and in the morning. And this is usually done in Jewish communities in synagogue. Technically, it needs to be read completely through and in the original language and from the Megillah, from a scroll. And the idea in halacha and Jewish law is that this was really it's supposed to look like a letter that someone is reading back then. And so we read it a little bit of a different way. And that's why you have to come to synagogue, though, because you have to actually hear it being read from the actual scroll. So really, really important to hear it, both in the evening and the day. So that's number one, most important mitzvah of Purim. Number two, gifts to the poor. It says in the Purim story that people were so excited that they gave gifts to the poor, right? And so what this is called in Hebrew is matanot le'evyonim, gifts to the poor. And we're required to give actual something that poor people can actually use right then and there on Purim. And this is very different than the Jewish commandment for tzedakah and for giving charity in other places. Most of the time, we can give charity in the form of, okay, I'm going to make a donation to an organization that's going to provide for the food needs, and sort of this indirect way of doing tzedakah, doing charity. Purim is really special because we're specifically only fulfill this mitzvah if we directly give something to a poor person who's directly in need and can use that item that day. So the ideal is to find somebody who is in need and give them money or something that they can use immediately, sandwich or something that they can immediately, that will make them happier that they have it. right? So if you gave money, for example, to an organization, the poor person's not going to know in Purim that you gave money to this organization. So that doesn't count, right? The way Rachel and I usually do this is, we used to go to the soup kitchen and stand outside the soup kitchen and give money to people, to poor people, and it was really a idyllic experience. We, would hand out, a $50 bill to, some random, somebody who's standing outside the soup kitchen, and just to see their eyes light up, and it's a miracle. I couldn't believe it. That's what Purim's all about, because you're giving that nahafochu, that like everything flips around experience. You're trying to give that to someone who's really in need now. Taking our suffering and our pain that we feel, and that ability that it turned around for us, and kind of passing that forward to a real poor person. And I just look, I think the experience also of actually giving to someone who's poor and in need, and seeing that and having that relational moment is so important. So I think this mitzvah is really, really important. Then the third mitzvah is gifts to friends. In Hebrew, this is called mishloach manot, and this is like basically like in some ways like Christmas or any other giving holiday, that there's so much joy that people gave gifts to each other. It says in the Megillah and in the book of Esther. So for that reason, we too give gifts to friends, and it's a requirement to actually at least give to one friend or one fellow person, Jew or not Jew, anybody who you consider a friend, two items of food. Okay, and I'm going to keep it simple for now, but basically two items of. The tradition has become really for people to make like goodie bags and like give them out when they're at synagogue and all around, and send them to their friends. There's companies that do this for you. You can buy them. Obviously, people always want an easier way to do these things, but it's a really nice thing to do, to send mishloach manot, little packages of food and candy to your friends on Purim. Something very important. And you should at least give two of these. Requirement is according to the rabbis. And then finally, the fourth mitzvah that needs to be practiced on Purim is a festive meal, Sudat mitzvah. And the idea is that that certain holidays, certain mitzvot require meals to be had, because a festive meal marks the way of is sort of the prototypical way we celebrate Judaism, right? As they say, and it's slightly right. They tried to kill us, all Jewish holidays. They try to kill us. We survived. Let's eat, right? And there is something to that, of that being part of sort of every Jewish holiday. And there's always the let's eat at the end. And so, a lot of the ways Rachel and I do this, we like to take off in the middle of the day on Purim and go to our favorite vegan burger place. And we go to, it's called Francis Burger. They didn't pay me for this advertisement. We go and have a nice meal together. We don't usually do that on Purim, and it's fun, and it's usually if obviously you don't have kids like crazy like us, you might want to invite your friends and have a nice evening something. So those are the four mitzvot of Purim. That's the way we observe Purim. That's actually what's required of you by Judaism, right? Now there are also other inyanim. There are other ideas of Purim that are important. Number one, blotting out the name of Amalek is really important. So there's a commandment in Judaism to remember what Amalek did to the Jewish people, and so and to blot out their name. The mitzvah of remembering Amalek is a difficult mitzvah in Judaism. It basically says, remember what these people did to you. You should hate them forever for what they did, and you should blot out their memory. Remember, and then the great paradox in the mitzvah is that you have to remember to block out the memory. How do you remember to forget something? Is a whole deal. But regardless, what this people called Amalek did, is that they, when the Jewish people were leaving Egypt, this is in Exodus, narrated in Exodus chapter 5, the beginning of Exodus chapter 14, I think. Basically, the Jews get across the Red Sea, the splitting of the Red Sea, and immediately they're attacked in their joy, they're attacked by the Amalekites, who sneak up from behind them and try to get them while they're weak, and try to get the sick and the unhealthy people in the back. And because what they do is, and really, I think in Jewish tradition, it seemed that those people were not in awe of God. They didn't see, they refused to listen and see the great miracles that God did. And so for this reason, Amalek becomes the real enemy of the Jewish people. We see in the book of Samuel that Shmuel, King Shaul, tries to destroy the Amalekites of his time under King Agag, and sort of doesn't do it so well. He decides to try to let King Agag live and let the livestock live, and so he's punished by Sam, whatever. Regardless, he tries to destroy the Amalekites, then doesn't really do it, right? And so who's a descendant of the Amalekites? Haman. Haman is a descendant of in Hebrew, Hagagi. He descends from this king Agag of Amalek. And for that reason, I think the idea of wiping out Amalek, that mitzvah is remembered during this time because Haman was killed at the end of the story. And this also symbolizes the idea that Amalek is always trying to go after us. And that in every generation, we have to look to uproot Amalek. Um, and so this is remembered. And it's for that reason why we blot out the name of Amalek. So I don't know if you've ever seen a Megillah reading before at synagogues. The universal Jewish custom is to make a lot of noise when Haman's name gets pronounced, and what that is us literally blotting out the name of Haman, right? Instead of hearing Haman, you hear grogger noise, right? Loud noise, and it's lamase in a very practical way to blot out the name of Amalek. And so that's what we're doing in that. So there's that theme there. And I generally think that leads to ideas about anti-Semitism and fighting anti-Semitism and overcoming anti-Semitism in Galut and exile. These themes sort of come up. Joy is a really important concept in this holiday. We have the tradition of the Gemara. The Talmud tells us, our rabbis tell us that once the month of Adar enters, Adar is the month of Purim. Purim occurs on the 15th of Adar or the 14th of Adar, depending on where you live. And we're told that when Adar enters, we marbim b'simcha, right? We try to multiply or increase greatly our joy. So really being happy on Purim is really important. And really that joy comes from the sort of ecstatic joy that everything can flip around in 1 second, right? I should have done intoxication before Tani to Esther. There is also a mitzvah in the Gemara. I don't want to say the mitzvah. There is an idea that in the Gemara that says you should be intoxicated on Purim. You should actually get drunk on Purim. And we always encourage people not to take this too far. But the Gemara takes it very far. It actually says that you should drink so much that you won't know the difference between Mordechai and Haman. Okay? Really, you won't know the difference between good and bad. And it's almost like this idea of like, thank God we're so joyous that like we overcame this, and so you drink because you're celebrating. But this sort of idea that like, look how hard this world is, look how nasty this world is. We had to kill all these people, and it's horrible that this is happening in the first place, right? So I think that is part of this as well. In general, this is sort of becomes a Jewish holiday of like Carnival. Like every culture has its like Carnival holiday. It's wacky holiday where everything's flipped upside down. That's this for Jews. And it's that reason why we wear costumes. Really the reason you wear costumes on Purim, it's not a mitzvah or anything like that. It's sort of a tradition, is because of we're trying to mimic what the party looked like in the beginning of the Purim story. But also I think there's an idea of hiding behind costumes, right? The idea that God is not present in the story, so everything is hidden, and we live in this place where God's presence is hidden, and so the costumes sort of figure into that as well. Finally, the other practice you should know about is called Tanit Esther, and there's a minor fast, meaning a fast that lasts from sunrise to sunset, basically, the day before Purim begins. So Purim begins at night. All Jewish holidays begin at night. So the day before that, right, is a fast. And the idea is that and the reason we do this is that the whole entire Jewish community supposedly fasted as commanded by Esther at the time, because of the decree of Haman wanting to kill the Jews. So in order to repent, the Jews all fasted before, as is Jewish tradition, to do repentance. And so too we shadow that by doing that as well. Make sense so far? Okay. We did most of these central messages. I'll go through them just very quickly so we can make sure to get to Hanukkah as well. Surviving in exile, God is hidden. Everything could change completely in a moment. That's the Nahafochu, what I was talking about. Use the power that you have, right? Don't wait for God to do a miracle, right? Figure out how you're going to solve the problem and use whatever means you have to save the lives of Jewish people. And finally, destruction. Amalek, anti-Semitic, right? And fighting against anti-Semitism. That always comes up around this time. Make sense so far? Any questions on Purim? My really fast overview of Purim? Yes.
Could you talk me a little more about the name Purim? Is it the name of a place? Is it a verb? What is like
So
the
it's really good. Yeah, it's really good question. Pouring, it means taking lots. The pour was a gambling mechanism that was used in Persia at the time. And this is if you read the Purim story, it's part of the Purim story to take lots. Just you should read the story and you'll figure it out. But I think that became the name of the idea because it sort of blends in with this idea of like the world is upside down and everything happens sort of by chance seemingly, and you have to take your chances and sort of idea behind it. But yeah, pouring means lots, right? Like gambling, lots. Make sense so far? All right. Any other questions on pouring before we go to Hanukkah? Okay, let's go to Hanukkah. All right. So Hanukkah comes from a historical period that's a little bit later. Basically, just continuing on the history, right? The Persians, the Jews build the second temple under Ezra and Nehemiah, and they're living in Eretz Israel. But the problem is the Persians don't last forever. And if you've learned Greek history, what happens? Who conquers the Persians? No,
the Greeks?
the Greeks, right? Alexander the Great, right? If you've learned your history, right, then again, the classic literature of the Greeks versus the Persians, if you've read Heraclitus and Theosophus, I'm a big fan of Greek of classic literature, so I love this stuff and the Peloponnesian Wars and all the Trojan War and everything like this. This is really the fight against the Persians, and eventually the Greeks win, right? And Alexander the Great conqueror, conquers the empire of Persia and takes over all their land. Alexander the Great divides up the empire into three different sections. And the section that Eretz Israel falls under is called the Seleucid Empire. Okay. So now Eretz Israel and the Jews who are living in the land of Israel and who are worshiping in the second temple that Ezra built, right, is all under Greek rule. And what ends up happening under Greek rule, that's kind of different, I would say, than Persian rule or Babylonian rule, is there's this really intense Greek culture, right, that we all know about because most of us learned about it in school, right? What did the Greeks offer? Like philosophy and theater and all the Olympic Games, and think about all the things that the Greeks are famous for. So this really comes out of Greek culture. And there was this thing called Hellenism, this Hellenizing element, which was basically the Grecization of colonies that were under Greece, right? And really there was a concerted effort to try to get civilize the populations by having them follow Greek ways, right? Whether that was going to the theater or going to gladiator games, going through Greek philosophy, secular, their kind of learning of what they did. And many people sort of took this upon themselves and really assimilated into Greek culture, right? Just as almost we have today in America, right? There are many Jews who are very assimilated into. You would never know a difference between who's Jewish and who's not, right? And then there are some Jews who really don't and really cling to Jewish culture. And so this really kind of split people. There are some Jews who really loved Greek culture, and then some Jews who really didn't. But basically, it all came to a head when the Greeks really went too far, and I guess this is the Jewish telling of it. It was basically the Greeks got angry at the Jews for not worshiping their gods, and set up a statue, an idol of Zeus in the temple, and basically defiled the entire temple. And so that began what was called, there were a couple of Kohanim and basically religious zealots, people who really, did not care for Hellenism and didn't care for Greek culture, and who said this was sort of a step too far. And really, this was really from the Kohanim of the time, the people who served in the temple. Obviously, they would be most hurt by the defamation of the temple. Basically, began a revolt and really the revolt happened under Judah Maccabee, and they revolted against the Greek overlords, and ended up winning in guerrilla combat, and were able to fend off the Greeks and push them out. This eventually resulted in the what's called the Hasmonean dynasty, and the Second Jewish Commonwealth. Basically, the Jews were able to a nation of their own, another country of their own. This was, around, the conquering of Israel, as Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, just so you can get kind of the idea. So this must have happened around 200, 250, something like that BCE, right? And the Jews have their finally second commonwealth, right? And they're able to finally rule their own land. Now, this is the Jewish side of the story. When you look at history, I think it's a little more complicated, and it's starting to look a little bit more like a civil war than a rebellion against the Greeks, because it was really a war against Jews, between Jews and Jews of, the Hellenistic Jews versus the Jews who are unassimilated, and what's the real Judaism, and what's the right way to be a Jew in the world. And of course, the Zealots went out, so you don't really have the Hellenistic Jews anymore. And that really is where Hanukkah comes from, is the celebration of this great military victory, this unbelievable American Revolutionary style victory against the Greeks, this small band of rebels overcoming the mighty Greek army, and rededicating the temple again after it was defiled by the Greeks, which is why the holiday is called Hanukkah. Hanukkah means dedication. L'chanech is to dedicate something. So it's the dedication is the rededication of the temple. So what we're really celebrating really is the rededication of the temple after defilement by the Greeks. Now, our rabbis, our sages, who are really the sages who lived from around 0 to 200 CE, and then the Talmud, rabbis of the Talmud all the way up to 500 CE, were pretty, I don't want to say that they were pacifists. It's really hard to figure out what they really felt, because of course the texts were under censorship as well from the Roman overlords of the time. But I think the rabbis understood very well that a small band of rebels fighting against the mighty Roman Empire does not go well. Just to give you a little history, in 135 CE, after the second temple eventually was destroyed in 70 CE by the Romans. And eventually, though, there was a Jewish rebellion against the Romans in 135 CE, when the rabbis were alive, right? This happened, and the rabbis knew about this, and they had different opinions on this. But unfortunately, the outcome of this rebellion was very unlike the Hanukkah story. The Romans destroyed the Jewish communities and completely wiped them out. It was horrible. Many Jews were annihilated. And worst of all, Jews were kicked out of Israel because they lost the war. And Jerusalem was named, you might recognize this name from somewhere, Palestina, okay? Because the Romans named the Eretz Israel after the biblical enemies of the Jewish people in the book of Kings and Samuel, the Philistines. That's how you say Philistines in Hebrew, Palestinim, because they wanted to insult them and wanted to make them feel it was no longer their land. I think you can read into that ramifications to why the word Palestinian is very frustrating for Jews, especially when you tell us that Palestinians are indigenous to the land. It's a ridiculous thing to say to a Jewish person because we just know the history. I mean, the history is very, very clear. But regardless, so you can understand that the Hanukkah story itself was pretty unpalatable to the rabbis. They did not want the people thinking, oh, well, if we just rise up and create a guerrilla army, we'll be able to overcome the mighty Roman Empire and be able to have a third Jewish Commonwealth, right? They didn't like this because they didn't want more Jews getting killed, right? They were sort of pragmatists and realists. So for the most part, what we find is the rabbis hide the holiday within the tractate of Shabbat. It's really all the laws of Hanukkah come out of the second chapter of the tractate on Shabbat. And many scholars think that the idea of this was trying to still observe the holiday, but sort of decrease it in its power to actually influence people to rebel against the Romans. Some scholars even think that it's for this reason that the rabbis created a new story, right, to tell for the reason of Hanukkah, and that's the famous miracle story of the Pach Shemen, right, of the vessel of oil. The story goes, and this story is told within the Talmud, when the Talmud asks, at one point it finally asks, what is Hanukkah? My Hanukkah. And this is what the Talmud says, that once the Jews were able to take over the temple, they found the Greeks had defiled all of the oil in the temple. Meaning they had offered it to alien gods, they had offered to Zeus. There was no more oil that was kosher to be used anymore, meaning it had never been offered to foreign gods. One pach shemen, one vessel of oil was found signed by the Kohen Gadol himself, right? By that this was kosher, that it was okay. And they lit the famous menorah in the temple. There was a 7-runged menorah in the temple that was commanded to have it all the way since the tabernacle in the book of Numbers. Basically, this menorah was lit again, but they only had enough oil for one night, from this one pach shemesh, one vessel, and miraculously it lasted 8 days. Okay, and that's why it's Hanukkah according to the rabbis, and that's why the celebration lasts 8 days. Okay, that's a wonderful, beautiful story to tell your children. And look, the idea of light and in winter and the light of the darkness is wonderful. But you can see how the rabbis sort of were trying to, and also, of course, what's inserted in here? God, right? A miracle happens, right? The story of the guerrilla warfare against the Greeks, it's narrated in the books of Maccabees, is not a story of God's intervention in history. It's at least in a revealed way, it's a story of military might and determination, which is also beautiful and great as well. But to the rabbis, that was a very dangerous message. And so for that reason, the story that became talked about was the miracle story. And the books that narrated the story called the books of Maccabees, some of which were written in Hebrew and some of which were written in Greek, unfortunately, I don't want to say unfortunately, just a fact, they were never part of the biblical canon of the Hebrew scriptures. So for that reason, you'll find the book of Maccabees in Catholic Bibles or Protestant Bibles. You will not find it it is not considered a Jewish holy book, okay? So we don't have it in our Tanakh, right, in our Jewish Bible. It's a very interesting book to read, but it's not considered holy literature for us. And it's again, I think it's the rabbis who made these decisions of what books of the Bible were canonized, and it's probably for this reason that the rabbis chose not to canonize this work. Make sense so far? Okay. So let's go into practices. So because always we have to ask, okay, so what do we do? Right? What are we commanded to do? Now, there are less mitzvot in celebrating Hanukkah than in Purim. Hanukkah really, the major mitzvah of Hanukkah is lighting Hanukkah candles. We remember the miracle by lighting Hanukkah candles in each night of Hanukkah. The tradition has become to light 1 candle the first night, 2 candles the second night, all the way to 8 candles the 8th night, on a special Hanukkah lamp called a Chanukiah, which looks a lot like a menorah, but it has 9 rungs. Very important. A Hanukkah candelabrum, right, is not a menorah. The menorah was the 7-branched candelabrum that was in the temple. It really is a Chanukiah, right? It's called a special Hanukkah lamp because it has 9 branches, right? 8 for the 8 nights and 1 to hold what's called the shamash, which is like the guiding or directing candle, which helps you light the other candles from. So the rabbinic mitzvah, the only real rabbinic mitzvah that comes out of this is lighting the candles. The idea is, and I think I should have put this in here, but I didn't. There's a rabbinic concept called Pirsume Nisa, which in Hebrew means the publicization of the miracle. And the idea, the rabbinic value in Hanukkah is to publicize the miracle that happened with oil. And for that reason, unlike every other Jewish holiday, there is sort of this idea to proclaim, almost, I hate to use this word, but evangelize people about this miracle that happened, right? And so for that reason, the menorah always needs to be put in a public place. That's why you see, for example, the tradition amongst Chabad is to have these gigantic menorah lights, gigantic Hanukkah lightings for Hanukkah, right? That comes out of this idea of this rabbinic principle of really letting people know about the miracle, putting it in public places. It's for that reason that the practice was originally to put the Hanukkah outside the door. It was originally supposed to be put outside Jews' houses, but due to anti-Semitism under Roman times, if you put a Hanukkah out, your house would be ransacked and destroyed because of anti-Semitism. And so to this day, our practice has changed, and we usually put the menorah Hanukkah inside our house. Still, the tradition is to put it by a window so it can be seen from the outside, unless it's really truly is dangerous, in which case you can just light it inside your house and not let anyone see. a good example of how Judaism is constantly influenced by anti-Semitism and the harsh reality of being a minority for the last 4,000 years. So that's lighting Shabbat candles. There's a later tradition of gift giving. Gift giving really is not, it's not really in Judaism for Hanukkah. It's really more of a tradition in Purim. That's really when we have a mitzvah to give gifts. But the reason we give gifts is very simple, because there's Christmas and we don't want Jewish children to be sad on Hanukkah, right? So it really became, once we started living amongst Christians, we started giving presents in the modern period to on Hanukkah, but it is not a mitzvah. It's not even, I wouldn't even say it's a, I wouldn't even say it's not even written anywhere in Jewish practice to do such things, but it really is a reaction to living amongst Christians and not having Jewish children be sad. They're the only ones not getting presents during this time. Okay? But very important to know that it's not a ritual obligation, right? It's just something we do. There's a tradition to eat fried foods a lot, latkes, and anything fried because of the oil concept and remembering the oil. We also have a mitzvah to say Hallel, which is Psalms 113 to Psalm 119, and to say that each day of the holiday to celebrate the great miracle that God did, and of course, in my mind also, the military victory as well. Any questions about this so far? Right. Well, the major themes of Purim, the rededication of the temple, Jewish practice. So Hanukkah, we really like to rethink about the temple and rededicating the temple, right? And in some ways, rededicating ourselves to Jewish practice amongst hardship, amongst fighting against assimilation really is a theme within Hanukkah, right? To not be Hellenized, to really remember our tradition. Obviously, standing up, fighting for Judaism. And again, this is not, I don't want to say this is a rabbinic concept, but really, I think the story of the Maccabean revolt against the Hellenists, against the Greeks, became more popular because that side of the story really became popular in Israel. The Zionists in the early, 20th century kind of didn't care much for the oil story and the miracle story because, well, they didn't believe in God. But they were secular, but they really believed in Jewish resistance and Jews fighting for themselves and self-determination. So for them, the Maccabees were a great model for what it meant to stand up against the British and, of course, the Arabs in the land who were stopping them from having a Jewish state. So these were great inspiring models for Zionists for the Maccabees, especially because, of course, this holiday happened in the land of Israel, unlike the Purim story, which doesn't, right? It kind of really became an idea of standing up for our rights, standing up for who we are, fighting against, for ourselves, standing up against assimilation. I talked about that. And of course, miracles and light as well. It's the miracle story. And of course, light, light up the darkness. See this because, well, it's a winter holiday. So it usually happens at the coldest period of the year. So that is Hanukkah. Any questions about Hanukkah at all? Anything that is weird about this? Anything that maybe you've heard of that I haven't talked about? Anything? No, it's perfect. It's perfect, crystal clear to you.
I don't know if this is really a question. It's more just, it's interesting that for both of these holidays, God isn't the central figure. It's just it's like the historical event, like what actually happened.
Yeah.
That I think is really, I mean, eventually, rabbinically God comes in with the oil in the lamp, but that's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point you're making. And I think this is the dialectic in Jewish history where we have this really close relationship with God. And we have these biblical stories about like Joshua conquering the land and not one Jew died fighting, and like these great miracle stories and stuff. But why don't we experience this anymore? Like that's not a reality anymore. And sort of the rabbis and Judaism's way of dealing with this. And if we're the chosen people, why aren't we in power? Why don't we have the land of Israel? I thought God gave us the land of Israel. Like how to deal with that darkness. And I think the Jews have answered that over the last 3,000 years of doing that and coping with that reality. And I think that's probably a bigger sense of what these holidays of history are all about. Of course, we see the hidden hand of God behind all of these things. It's really important. We thank God for these things that happened. But I think it's a really good observation you make. Other comments, questions, thoughts, ideas? things that need to be elucidated, whether on Zoom or in person. Perfectly clear. I love it. I love it. Okay.
Perfectly
Wonderful.
clear.
I love that, David. Thank you. I think we're finished for today. Please, if you have any questions, you can always email me, rmr@templeofaaron.org. Eventually, this will go on YouTube and podcast. If you want to review it, you can. Next week, we'll be meeting at 7 o'clock. We'll start going through the mourning holidays, really the holidays of the destruction of the temple and everything like this. We'll do that. And of course, if anyone wants to know the dates of these things, Purim usually happens in the springtime, the early spring, very early spring. It's usually snowing still here. And Hanukkah happens in the around Christmas time. So that's usually what happens. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see everybody.